The sound of war has a rhythm all its own, the hum of engines, the thunder of artillery, and the soft, distant echo of lives changing forever. In the early 1940s, that rhythm reached its crescendo. Across Europe, cities smoldered. The Axis powers had seized control of the skies, and for a time it seemed as if no force could match their dominance. But far across the Atlantic, in the sprawling factories and design rooms of the United States, a new idea was taking shape. An aircraft that would change the course of aerial warfare. It wasn't built for beauty. It wasn't made for grace. It was built for power, for endurance, and for the brutal necessity of war. They called it the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a name that would soon echo across every front where freedom hung by a thread. When engineers at Republic Aviation first imagined the Thunderbolt, it was almost too ambitious to believe. The United States Army Air Forces needed a fighter that could fly higher, faster, and hit harder than anything before it. Something that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory and survive the journey home. But ambition often comes with doubt. Early on, even the designers questioned if their creation would ever leave the ground. The plane was enormous for a fighter, heavier than anything its rivals dared to build. Some said it looked more like a flying tank than a fighter aircraft. Yet, behind that bulk lay its heart. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a massive 18-cylinder radial engine capable of unleashing more than 2,000 horsepower. When it roared to life, it didn't sing like a Spitfire. It growled. It announced itself. The Thunderbolt wasn't designed to dance in the air like its British or German counterparts. It was designed to dominate it. As the war in Europe intensified, the Allies faced a harsh truth. Their bombers, the mighty flying fortresses and liberators, were being torn apart by German fighters. Without long-range escorts, entire crews vanished over occupied territory. The need for a protector grew desperate. That's when the Thunderbolt made its entrance, first in small numbers, then in waves that filled the skies. When pilots first saw the P-47, some laughed. It looked too heavy to fight, too slow to survive. But when they took it up for the first time, they realized they were sitting inside something extraordinary. It could dive like a hawk, its weight turning gravity into a weapon. It could take bullets, flak, and fire, and somehow still bring its pilot home. It didn't need to outturn its enemy, it simply outlasted them. The first Thunderbolts arrived in England in 1943, their wings gleaming in the cold light of British airfields. Pilots trained relentlessly, adjusting to the aircraft's power and quirks. Its cockpit was spacious, almost comfortable, a luxury for a fighter of its time. But comfort didn't mean safety. The sky over Europe was unforgiving. The Luftwaffe ruled the air with the deadly Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, agile, deadly predators. The P-47's first missions tested not only its steel, but the courage of the men inside. Many of them were barely out of their teens. Farm boys, factory workers, sons who had left everything behind to fight for people they would never meet. And when they took off into the grey English morning, they carried with them not only their own fates, but the hopes of a world waiting for deliverance. The Thunderbolt's early combat days were not without loss. Some pilots struggled to master its heavy frame. Others never returned from those first encounters. But each mission taught new lessons. Each loss refined the machine and the men who flew it. Engineers improved range with drop tanks. Pilots learned how to use its immense dive speed to their advantage. Slowly, the aircraft that once drew skepticism began to earn respect, even fear. German pilots would later speak of its relentless presence, how the P-47 would dive from the clouds like an avenging spirit, unleash its 850 caliber machine guns, and climb away through smoke and fire. It was not graceful, but it was unstoppable. By the spring of 1943, the Thunderbolt had found its rhythm. The Allies were no longer just surviving in the skies, they were beginning to fight back. And in that turning point, the P-47 became more than a machine. It became a symbol of resilience, of might, and of the quiet determination that defined those who fought the air war. As one pilot later said, "When you flew the Jug, you knew it would get you home. It might be dented, scorched, and leaking oil, but it would bring you back. It was the aircraft that refused to die, and soon the world would see why." By the summer of 1943, the skies over Europe had become a crucible, a place where courage and fear met in equal measure. Every mission began the same way, engines growling in the cold morning air, propellers biting through the mist, and rows of Thunderbolts lined up like armored sentinels. The men who flew them had learned a simple truth. Survival meant trusting the machine and trusting the man beside you. From their bases in England, the Thunderbolts roared eastward toward enemy territory, escorting bombers bound for factories, rail lines, and airfields deep within the Reich. Their job was brutal in its simplicity: protect the bombers, engage the enemy, and bring as many men home as possible. But no one truly came home unchanged. At 20,000 feet, the world was a thin, fragile place. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Oxygen masks frosted over. The air was clear, cruelly clear, and in that clarity you could see death coming from miles away. German fighters would appear like black dots on the horizon, growing larger with every second. Radio chatter turned from calm coordination to shouted warnings. Then, chaos. Tracer rounds ripped through the sky. The sound of gunfire was muffled by altitude, a strange, detached kind of violence. A pilot's world became a blur of motion. Diving, rolling, firing, climbing. A dance where one mistake could mean a fall through miles of empty sky. And through it all, the Thunderbolt endured. Where lighter planes might disintegrate under fire, the Jug absorbed punishment like a fortress. Its armor plating and radial engine gave pilots a fighting chance when everything else went wrong. Countless men would later recall limping home, engines coughing, wings shredded, sometimes trailing smoke or even fire, yet still flying. That resilience became legend. In those early missions, one name began to echo through airfields across Britain: Francis Gabi Gabreski. A Polish-American pilot with unshakable focus and a sharp instinct for air combat, Gabreski became one of the most successful Thunderbolt aces of the war. He once described his aircraft simply, "It was a brute, but it was my brute in his hands." The Thunderbolt wasn't just a weapon, it was a partner. He used its power to dive on the enemy with astonishing speed, strike, and then climb back into the clouds before the Germans could react. Others soon followed his lead. Pilots began to understand the Thunderbolt's true potential, not as a nimble duelist, but as a hammer of the skies. Its 8 machine guns could tear through bombers, trains, even armored vehicles on the ground. It wasn't just a fighter anymore, it was an all-purpose weapon of war. By late 1943, the Thunderbolt's reach had extended beyond the airfields of England. New drop tanks allowed it to escort bombers deeper into Germany than ever before. Its pilots began targeting supply lines, fuel depots, and enemy transport, cutting off the arteries that kept the German war machine alive. On the ground, soldiers and civilians alike learned to fear the sight of its broad silhouette, glinting in the sunlight. German troops nicknamed it the Juggernaut, and for good reason. With the roar of its engine and the blaze of its guns, the Thunderbolt could reduce a convoy to wreckage in seconds. It became the embodiment of relentless power. the sound that announced liberation and destruction in the same breath. Yet even in victory, the cost remained heavy. Pilots returned from missions haunted by what they had seen: the flash of a friend's plane exploding in mid-air, the helpless spiral of a comrade falling through the clouds. They learned not to ask too many questions in the mess hall. If someone's bunk was empty in the morning, you simply nodded and carried on. War teaches silence as much as courage. Still, the bond among these men was unlike any other. In the cockpit, alone at 30,000 feet, they found a strange clarity, a focus that made everything outside the mission seem distant and unreal. They didn't fight for medals or glory. They fought for each other, for the bombers ahead, for the men on the ground waiting for that next sunrise to come. In late 1943, the Thunderbolt entered a new chapter. It was no longer a newcomer, it was the backbone of the Allied Air Force. Its pilots had earned respect, and its engineers continued to refine it, increasing its speed, maneuverability, and range. The war was shifting. The Allies were gaining ground, both in the air and on the continent below. The skies that had once been dominated by the Luftwaffe now belonged to the Thunderbolt and its growing family of pilots. But the storm was far from over. Ahead lay the invasion of Normandy, a moment that would test not only the machine's strength, but the resolve of every man who flew it. The Thunderbolt had proven itself a fighter. Now it would become something more. By 1944, the war had entered its most decisive stage. Across the English Channel, the greatest invasion in history was being prepared. The Allied planned to retake Europe, to break the grip of Nazi Germany, and to end the tyranny that had consumed the continent. But before a single soldier could set foot on the beaches of Normandy, the skies had to be won. Every convoy, every landing craft, every parachute drop depended on it. The Thunderbolt, now seasoned and battle-tested, stood ready for the task. Its pilots had grown from uncertain recruits into hardened veterans. They had learned the sky's language, its winds, its moods, its dangers. And now they would write the next chapter of the war in thunder and fire. In the months leading up to D-Day, Thunderbolts swarmed over occupied France and the Low Countries. Their mission: destroy everything that could resist the invasion. Bridges, supply trains, communications posts, nothing was safe from their reach. Flying low over hedgerows and villages, the Jug became a terror of the German army. It carried bombs under its wings, rockets slung beneath its belly, and the same 8 machine guns that had already proven devastating in the air. From above, German troops watched helplessly as columns of armor were shredded by strafing runs. For the soldiers on the ground, the sound of that radial engine meant one thing: death was coming fast. One pilot later recalled, "You could see the tracers hitting the ground like molten rain. Every run felt like riding lightning." The Thunderbolt was no longer just an escort fighter. It had evolved into the premier ground attack aircraft of the European theater. It flew low, it hit hard, and it came home in one piece more often than any other fighter. Its ruggedness became its legend. When June 6, 1944 arrived, D-Day, the Thunderbolts were among the first to strike. Before dawn, they swept across the French coast, hitting radar sites, artillery positions, and German strongholds that could threaten the landing forces below. As Allied troops stormed the beaches, the sky was alive with motion. Hundreds of aircraft filled the air: Spitfires, Mustangs, Lightnings, and Thunderbolts, all working in deadly harmony. The P-47s dove into the chaos, unleashing their fury on enemy bunkers and armored reinforcements. For the men fighting on the beaches, those roars overhead were a lifeline. Many soldiers would later say that the sound of the Thunderbolt's guns gave them the courage to move forward. proof that they were not alone. Throughout that summer, as the Allies pushed inland, the P-47 became the hammer that broke the German war machine. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the plains of Belgium, the Jug's firepower tore apart supply lines and armored divisions trying to regroup. The Luftwaffe, once feared across the world, was now a shadow of its former self. Each day the sky filled with the rumble of thunderbolts and the smoke of burning convoys below. German pilots who had once hunted the skies were now being hunted themselves. They called the Thunderbolt the butcherbird's rival, a grim nod to its ability to strike with merciless precision. But war, even when it turns in your favor, is never kind. Each victory carried its share of loss. Pilots who had survived dozens of missions sometimes vanished in an instant, hit by flak, torn by shrapnel, or forced to bail out over enemy lines. For those who returned, the memories of the fallen never left them. They would land, climb down from their aircraft, and stare for a moment at the empty space beside them on the tarmac. No one spoke. They didn't have to. Yet even in grief, they kept flying. Each sortie, each mission brought the war closer to its end. And as the Allies swept across France and into Germany, the Thunderbolt led the charge. It became the guardian angel of advancing troops, a constant presence above the battlefield, its shadow cast over liberation itself. In the autumn of 1944, as the Allies reached the borders of Germany, the Thunderbolt's legend was complete. It had destroyed thousands of tanks, trains, and vehicles. It had held its own against the best German fighters, and it had earned the love and respect of every man it had protected below. By the time winter arrived, its roar had become the sound of inevitable victory. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted that December, the P-47 once again proved its worth. In freezing weather, often flying through snow and fog, Thunderbolt pilots launched attack after attack against German positions, trying to break the Allied lines. Despite the cold, the chaos, and the constant danger, the Jug endured. Its radial engine could take punishment, even the more delicate liquid-cooled fighters couldn't. When others were grounded, the Thunderbolt flew, and it kept flying until the tide of war finally broke for good. By early 1945, the skies over Europe belonged to the Allies. The Luftwaffe was broken. German cities lay in ruins, and wherever Thunderbolts flew, the message was clear: the end was near. But victory never felt simple. For those who had fought from the first missions to the last, it was a bittersweet triumph. They had seen too much: fire, loss, sacrifice, to feel joy without reflection. As one pilot said, "We didn't feel like heroes. We just felt tired, but we knew we'd done our job." Spring came slowly to Europe in 1945. The smoke of war still hung over ruined cities, and the ground was littered with the debris of a world that had nearly destroyed itself. But through that ruin, freedom began to return. The thunder that had once shaken the skies was fading, not in defeat, but in triumph. The war was ending, and with it came a strange, quiet stillness. After years of noise and fury, silence felt almost foreign. For the men who had flown the Thunderbolt, that silence carried a weight all its own. In the final months of the war, the P-47 had become a symbol of endurance. While newer aircraft like the sleek P-51 Mustang captured the headlines, it was the Thunderbolt that had done the grinding, unrelenting work from the first days over Europe to the very last. It escorted bombers across hostile skies, fought in the fiercest dogfights, and dove through anti-aircraft fire to protect soldiers on the ground. It wasn't graceful, but it was unbreakable. In the words of one pilot, "The Jug didn't just fight the war, it carried it." By VE Day, The Thunderbolt had flown more than 500,000 combat sorties. It had dropped tens of thousands of tons of bombs and destroyed an enemy infrastructure that had once seemed invincible. And when the guns finally fell silent, it stood as one of the most successful and beloved aircraft of the entire war. But for the men who flew it, victory was never simple. They returned home to a world that felt both familiar and changed. The laughter of children, the smell of home-cooked meals, the hum of city streets, all of it was the same, yet somehow different. Because once you've looked down from 30,000 feet on a burning world, you never quite see it the same way again. Some pilots became instructors, others never flew again. Many carried the memories of those lost with them for the rest of their lives. They remembered names that the world would forget. The friends who didn't come home, the quiet moments before takeoff, the sound of the engine that had once meant life itself. In the stillness of peacetime, the roar of the Thunderbolt echoed only in memory. As years passed, technology marched forward. Jets replaced propellers. New wars began, new machines took flight, and the P-47 slowly faded from active service. But it never vanished. In air shows, in museums, and in the stories told by aging veterans, the Jug's spirit lived on. A testament to an era when the fate of the world hung on wings of steel. For historians, it remains one of the greatest engineering triumphs of the Second World War. A perfect blend of raw power, survivability, and simplicity. For those who flew it, it was something more personal. A guardian, a home, and sometimes the last friend they ever saw. When you see one today, polished, restored, sitting silent in a hangar, it's easy to forget what it once was. You can't smell the oil, or feel the vibration of the engine through the seat, or hear the pounding rhythm of its guns. You can't see the cold breath of a pilot inside the canopy as he prepares for another mission into the unknown. But if you stand close enough and listen, you might still sense it. The ghost of a roar, the whisper of courage. The Thunderbolt story isn't just about machinery or metal. It's about endurance in the face of impossible odds. It's about the people, engineers, mechanics, pilots, and countless others, who believed that strength and sacrifice could turn the tide of history. In time, the Thunderbolt found new skies. Some served in foreign air forces, others in reserve squadrons, and a few even in the Pacific, where they fought a different kind of war. Everywhere they went, they carried the same legacy: toughness, loyalty, and the will to fight on when everything else seemed lost. For the pilots who had once called them home, seeing a Thunderbolt years later was like seeing an old friend. Scarred, aged, but still proud. Some reached out to touch its fuselage, their fingers tracing the same rivets they once trusted with their lives. And in that touch, they found something words could never express. History often remembers wars by their victories or their defeats, but the story of the Thunderbolt reminds us that history is also made in the long stretches between, in the missions that went unseen, the acts of endurance that never made the headlines. It was not the prettiest aircraft, nor the fastest, but it was the fighter that never gave up. It was built by ordinary people, flown by ordinary men who did extraordinary things. As one veteran said in his later years, "When you heard that engine, you felt safe. That sound, it meant hope." Today, as time carries us further from that war, the memory of the Thunderbolt still matters, not just as a machine, but as a reminder of resilience, of courage, and of the human spirit that refuses to break. It tells us that power alone doesn't win wars. Determination does. The will to keep flying, even when the sky is on fire, that's what defines heroes. So when the last Thunderbolt lifts from the runway, its engine rumbling across a quiet sky, it carries more than its own weight. It carries the memory of every pilot who once trusted their life to its wings. It carries the story of a generation that rose to meet the storm and won. The war may be long over, the skies may be peaceful again, but the echo of that power, that thunder, still rolls on. And if you listen closely enough, you can still hear it. The roar of the jug, the sound of freedom itself.